Thank you all for joining us today. Today we'll be covering the transition to PCI 4.0 with a service partner. Today, Chris Donaldson and Andrew Parks will be covering this topic with you all. So Chris, you can go ahead and get started.
Cool. So thank you, everyone. This is, I guess of the PCI with an outsourced partner series that we've been doing. This is the third installation of that. But for this one, we decided to bring on our PCI delivery lead. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. But we're very excited to have, to talk to everyone today. Very excited for the content we have to share. So before we get going and talk about, kind of the journey and where we're going to go today, I'll go ahead and just introduce myself. So my name's Chris Donaldson, if you don't know me. So I'm the director here at Risk 360. I lead both our PCI practice as well as our vCISO or advisory services practice. Been a QSA for a while. Been doing a lot of PCI, and we've been helping a lot of clients recently think about and consider 4.0. So with me is Andrew Parks. As I mentioned, he leads our actually is our manager of our PCI practice. He leads the delivery of our services. Andrew, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that. So yeah, my name's Andrew Parks. I'm the manager of the PCI QSA program here at Risk 360. As far as being in the PCI world, I've been in it over 10 years, over a decade. I started out first 5 years or so as an ISA in a larger corporate environment, and then I made the transition to QSA about 5 or 6 years ago. So I have kind of that both experience on the internal side and the external side, which I think will lend to this presentation here when we start talking about partners and QSAs and how to select the best partner and things like that. So
awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So here's where we're going today. So we are going to talk through specifically 4.0, right? And what does this journey look like? How do you think about it? Key questions, and more specifically, like where does an external partner fit into that equation? Kind of what do we recommend? So to start with, let's talk about where things are at right now, right? So the current world of PCI version 3.2.1, what are characteristics there? So first of all, right now, PCI is really, Andrew, PCI is really control-based. Right now, I think for every organization, everyone thinks about it as 300 and some odd controls and compliance with those controls, right? Anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, it's very detailed. It's very prescriptive. Here's the 350 things you need to do. There's not a lot of wiggle room when we get into them as far as, it's not really risk-based, right? It's very prescriptive as far as here's the controls, here's the settings, here's what they need to be. So that's current state 3.2.1 is really, they just lay it out there what they expect, and it doesn't add for a lot of flexibility in different environments and allowing companies to kind of do things differently.
Yep. Do you want to talk around the point in time element of it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about point in time assessment, everybody has an assessment date, right? So let's say it's November 10th, just pulling a date out of the air. So when we talk about November 10th, out of those 350 so controls, probably about 340 of them we're assessing at that point in time as far as that November 10th date. Is it in place? Did we observe it? And is it in place at that November 10th date? They do have some outliers as far as internal scans, external scans, things that have to happen on a quarterly basis or maybe a 6-month basis, like reviewing firewall rules and things like that. But the majority of controls is really going to be, is it in place or is it not in place on that November 10th date? And the report that you get is really a point in time assessment of that November 10th date. Have you done everything on that November 10th date, your configurations? And that allows you to kind of catch things early and be able to remediate prior to that November 10th date without really any impact to your overall assessment or compliance and things like that. So yeah, if you had anything else.
This is a big one that for a lot of organizations that kind of work, if you're working with a QSA, you're working with someone who's been in PCI for a while, they know how to like work the cadence of things, right? So you could have found something in the assessment, right? In the actual, like your QSAs on site, they could have found something, but it will never show up in the ROC. It will never show up in the AOC. It will show up nowhere because it was fixed before, before the actual compliance date, right? Before the signature date, or it was made, a determination was made by the QSA that, all right, we're going to compensate for it somehow, right? There's ways of, I don't want to say hiding necessarily, but there's ways of not necessarily representing the state of compliance throughout the year, right? It's the state of compliance on the day that you signed the report, right? And that's really important.
Yeah, one big thing I'll just call out here as an example is like, let's imagine we have two companies, Company A and Company B. Company A, we start getting into their environment and they have a lot of gaps, right? And they have to fix those gaps over a couple months prior to their November 10th date. Company B, we go in, they have a very, structured governance program. They're very mature in their processes. They have everything in place. We don't find anything. It's a very straightforward audit. At the end of those, as long as Company A remediates all their things, they're getting the same report, right? There's no differences there as far as your acquirers and your card brands and things like that. They're not going to see the process that went into Company A versus Company B. So that's kind of the end result, is like the point in time assessment. Like you said, we don't really want to say hide things, but the end result is going to be the same for both of those companies, which is
right.
A good way to think about it in your head.
Yeah. Another piece as well as with regard to scope, right? So in every ROC, there's obviously quite a few sections around scope, like what subsidiaries or systems and descriptions of payment channels, but there's never actually been a requirement in the DSS for scope management, which is surprising. But I mean, all of that basically has been discretionary, or it's been recounted or accounted for rather by the QSA or who's ever writing the report when you actually do the ROC or do the SAQ, right? Whatever we're talking about here. So that definitely is something that is current state, that organizations also don't have to build a ton of rigor around as a consequence, because there's no control associated with it.
Yeah, absolutely. As a QSA going into companies, a lot of your time up on the first week or so is going through payment flows and data flows and stuff like that, trying to determine their scope. Because a lot, unless they have that really mature governance program, don't really have that formally documented currently. And then again, it's a point in time assessment. So there's no real control around, okay, we get halfway through the assessment and we discover this new, maybe it's a return flow, right? Somebody's calling in and how are they taking returns, and that's a new flow. So they just build out that new data flow diagram, and there's really no requirement to kind of document that stuff and make sure it's up to date ahead of time going into the assessments.
Mm-hmm. And then two last ones just to touch on real quick with the, where things are right now, how we've been doing things for the past, 8-9 years at this point since 3.0 was released, which I think was like 2014. Is that organizations do these enterprise cyber risk assessments like Control 12.2. And then there's defined cadences for when, how often certain things should happen, right? Like how often your AV needs to scan, right? Or it just says periodic, right? In some cases, it's whatever periodic means. It gives you some gray area there to be discretionary. So this is where we are, right? Switching gears, right? Let's talk about where we're going, right? Like what things are going to look like in the next, I guess it's April 1st of 2024. So what is that? 8 months ish? I don't know. I'm bad at math, but next, April of next year, right? So in contrast to the controls-based approach, right? PCI 4.0 really is, I mean, Andrew, I think you would we've talked about this, but it really is more of like a risk-based approach or objective-based approach to compliance.
Yeah, I would say a good way to think about it is the council, the PCI SSC really came together and they said, okay, we understand that not every environment's the same. You could have a really technical service provider, or you could have somebody like a merchant or something like that. Those environments look completely different. So we need to start accounting for that and the actual risk that's in those environments and what we need to place on it. And I think they're taking steps in 4.0, and it's pretty clear that they're trying to get to that point where they can have one standard that really is a little bit more broad and lets you kind of determine the cadences for a lot of things like password changes, like things like that, like the antivirus stuff that you're talking about. So yeah, I think they're definitely going risk-based, and I think it's driven by the fact that they understand that environments are getting more and more different, right? There's cloud-based environments, there's on-prem environments, and they want to start accounting for that by allowing to put the control back in the hands of the entities to kind of identify the risks and what's most important to their environments. So
yeah, I completely agree. Another, let's see, talking about another, update just in the way things are going to be versus the way things are right now is, as we mentioned, right, there are, from a point in time perspective, I mean, 4.0 really is a lot more considering the span, right? Considering like the period of time. This came out, was it in June? This IF&I worksheet?
Recently,
right?
Yeah, very recently.
Yeah, so if everyone's aware, I mean, you've been doing PCI a while, there's really not been a standard way of capturing or documenting gaps or communicating gaps, right? I think for at least assessors to, assessed entities, there's not been everyone's kind of had their own way of doing it, right? So what they've done though is it's now a requirement around this IF&I worksheet, this items noted for improvement worksheet. Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit more about this and like kind of how this will fit and work?
Yeah, absolutely. You hammered it home a little bit there at the beginning as far as what it is. It's just a standard template where when we start catching things throughout the assessment cycle, we can document them in a standard and repeatable process, right? Some things that it calls out is like, what is the gap? What was done to remediate it over the course of the project? How was it validated by your QSA that it was remediated and that it was in place and it does assess the risk and things like that? So instead of having company A and company B have the same exact report, now company A has these INFI worksheets that go along with their report, that now it's giving more visibility from the acquirer and from the card brands as far as not only are they compliant, but also maybe they're not getting as many findings, they're maturing their processes over the years and things like that. So it just gives more visibility on the back end for how the project went and how it's maturing year over year.
Now, do you know, I don't know, so you may have more information on this, Andrew. So right now, typically, a customer is not going to request is not going to get access to your ROC. They'll get your AOC, but not your ROC. Are merchants and service providers going to need to submit their IF&I worksheet as well to their acquirer as a part of their ROC submission?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't think they released that guidance yet. Again, this is just like a month old that they released the worksheet as itself. So they're probably even getting feedback on the worksheet from the different QSA companies and things like that. I would assume right now, without any discretion or guidance from the console, it would be up to the acquirers and the payment brands to request them. And it's well within their right to request that kind of documentation and things as you submit. But again, I don't think any guidance has been placed out there if those are required to be submitted at the same time. I think they're leaving that up to the acquirers right now.
Yeah, because the QSAs are going to have to sign the IF&I worksheet as well. Like it's an actual officially submitted document in conjunction with the assessment. It's required by the QSA quality assurance process as well. That like this is an actual deliverable in the same way that a ROC and an AOC are deliverables associated with an assessment.
Yeah, and I would not be surprised if this is something in 4.1 that they just roll into the actual report template as a annex or a footnote or something like that. As far as they release this after it, I think they've kind of thought of this a little bit after it. But when they release 4.1, the revision, I would expect or not be surprised if they just rolled this into the to a new annex underneath the ROC report. Yeah.
Yeah, you can definitely see. And again, neither of us work for the council, so like we don't know exactly what's going on. Maybe they'll have more at the conference this year. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But they had, when they rolled out 4.0 originally, like the ROC or the actual ROC reporting template, there was a qualification, there was an actual status which was in place with remediation, right? It was, which was brand new to 4.0. It was, I assume they got a tremendous amount of pushback, and people did not like that because they essentially re-released the new ROC template to pull that out, right? And then they added this in. So it definitely seems like the council is moving more towards that like transparency, so that, I mean, somebody, right, whether it be a customer or whether it be an acquirer, right, has visibility into not just the point in time, but like, were there gaps that had to get fixed, right? Like, was this not in place until the assessment essentially happened and then it got fixed, right? So I really don't think that this is the last we've seen of this kind of line of thinking or progress here. I think they'll probably, to your point, continue to iterate on it and refine it, and then incorporate it more formally into like documentation and like maybe the AOC eventually. Another thing that we want to point out in terms of like updates is, as we mentioned previously, scope was not it was not had to be formally defined by the organization. It was more of a QSA conversation and scope activity that happened at the beginning of every assessment for every year. More mature merchants and service providers, they maintain their scope and scope documentation, but for organizations that are not on the far right of maturity, right, they haven't been doing this. It's now a requirement in 4.0 that you have to maintain this. And not only that, if you vary between the documented and observed scope, like that actually comes up as a finding in your assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say, previously it was more of a QSA responsibility to kind of identify and understand the scope when you got into it. They're kind of pulling that out and putting it back on the merchant or service provider entity and saying, no, you have to document it. And when the QSA comes on site, he's just validating what you documented and have verified, rather than doing that discovery and doing that scoping and things like that. So.
Yeah. I'm just gonna mention it now and I'll mention it later. We have quite a few resources available on the Risk 360 website for this sort of thing. Like, we do have a scope template. In this case, Andrew, I think we actually built it based off of 4.0, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So if you need a resource around, hey, I need to document my scope somehow that actually is going to meet the requirements in 4.0, something that I can manage over time, go to the risk360.com, go to the resources section. I think Corey will link it in the YouTube video whenever this goes to YouTube for the link to that page. But there's several other resources as well that can help you essentially stand up and accelerate your program. Obviously, make sure if you need those are available to you. And then the last thing here in terms of like future state is, just again, in contrast to this enterprise risk assessment, there's gonna be more. They're changing that 12.2 kind of control to be targeted risk assessments or cyber risk assessments, and it's for the purposes I think in most cases of supporting like the showing your work around how you came to whatever periodicity certain controls need to operate on.
Yeah, I think again, hammering at home that they're transitioning over to the risk assessment side of they understand your environment is probably going to be more unique in the future than it has in the past. A lot of 321 was really written kind of with on-prem systems in mind and things like that. So this is kind of adding that flexibility where you can determine the periodic controls and things like that going forward. So
cool. All right, so look, we're going to touch on some common questions just associated with PCI, associated with the DSS, that we can potentially help flush out as well with the transition. So number one is, how does, and Andrew, this one's to you, right? So how does work from home affect PCI compliance in 4.0?
Yeah, so this is something that's been brought up multiple times from our customers as well. not only for 4.0, but because of so much work from home transition over the pandemic and just the recovery, a lot of people are still working from home. And when we talk about 4.0, there's really a push to be on site from an assessor's perspective with QSAs. So in 3.2.1, we had to say, did you do on site or did you do remote? And what was your rationale there? In 4.0, basically what they're saying is, did you do on site? And if you didn't do on site, what was the legal or technical constraint that stopped you from going on site? So they're really pushing for the assessors to be more on site. And with that comes questions about, well, we have this huge work from home presence, and we do have this corporate environment or this corporate building, but nobody's sitting in it, or not the people that you're going to be talking to sitting in it. They're spanned across the globe, right? Or across the United States. So when we talk about work from home, the first question that always pops up is, if we have developers working from home, will the QSA have to visit their home and do the physical assessment, right? No, we won't. So it sounds a little silly, but I think we've gotten that question multiple times, Chris. So
I feel like we have, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
it's actually it's such a common question that the SSC has 3 FAQs about it out there, because I Googled it before this. They actually released 3 different FAQs asking the question in different ways. And their response was, no, your QSA doesn't have to go on the home site. Now, that doesn't mean that the people working from home are exempt from all controls. So you still have to look at controls such as sensitive data movement and transfer. So if they're taking credit card payments and they're putting them up into a web portal, previously maybe they were on the internal network and you don't have to encrypt unless it's going over the open public network, right? But now you really need to think about either a VPN connection for them that's securing that over the open public network, or you really need to look at the encryption strength and the algorithms to that payment page that they're taking, or that product on the back end. So you still have to think about those kinds of controls going forward. The other thing is, like, patching is a big thing with work from home. You don't have real control over your workstations. They'll probably power them off at night. So you need to have a more formal process for patching and making sure those stay up to date, because you don't want to get to the assessment and notice that, well, all of our payment taking folks working from home are out of date on their Microsoft OS and things like that, right? And the only other thing I'll say, these are just kind of things general to keep in mind, is working from home, you want to make sure you train your people to understand shoulder surfing and overhearing conversations and things like that, especially payment taking folks. You want to make sure that while we're not assessing their environment, they should be working from like a home office. They shouldn't be taking credit card payments at a coffee shop and things like that, right? So they need to understand that there are risks on the data that you're taking and where you should be taking it, and the expectation for privacy as far as where they're sitting and things like that. So those are kind of the things to keep in mind while we're talking about work from home environment going into 4.0, and kind of how that looks during an assessment or just your business as usual kind of processes.
Yeah, no, really good response. Other question we got, or we get, right, is, if I miss a periodic activity, this is in 4.0 world, if I miss a periodic activity like an ASV scan or an internal scan or whatever, right, does that mean I'll have to file as non-compliant? So the answer is no, actually, with a huge asterisk, right? So this IF&I worksheet that they released is essentially the bridge, that, like, the actual mechanism to address this particular use case. So in this case, you would, in the IF&I worksheet, the gap would be identified, and then the remediation would be documented and tracked and showed it's been validated so this doesn't happen again, right? We'll take an ASV scan, for example. So standing dust just decided to fly up on me, running away.
Thought you were getting a cinematic shot.
Yeah, we're trying to show the
knowledge on us.
Studio here. Yep. So with an ASV scan, right? So we missed the ASV scan in Q1. We can't do anything about it, right? It's Q2. I cannot show you a Q1 ASV scan. So what can I do? I can show a couple of things. We can now go to monthly ASV scanning, right? Like, we can say, hey, look, we know we missed it. the gap is featured in the IFNI. What we've done is we've gone to monthly scanning, right? And we have consistently shown monthly scans. So if I'm the QSA and that I see that, what I see now is an organization that has a process in place that not only will this not happen again, but they're going above and beyond to, make sure the objective is met, which is that external vulnerabilities are, identified and, addressed and managed. So there is a path forward. I know that's been a place, an opportunity for heartburn for a lot of folks in the past of, if I miss an activity, am I just toast? But the good news is no, and there's a mechanism, like a formal mechanism to facilitate that, which is encouraging. Andrew, do you want to take this one? So how do I approach the customized approach, or what should I do? Should I do the customized approach, and how do I know if it's right for my organization?
Yeah, I can definitely take that. Let's level set at the beginning, because we've gotten a lot of questions about customized approach, what they're used for, and will it benefit my company? So when we talk about a customized approach at a high level, this is first and foremost additional work for your company, more and above the requirements and things like that. And it's really supposed to be used for very mature companies that are choosing to do the requirement and address the risk in a different way rather than what's spelled out in the PCI DSS. Again, this all kind of leads back to my point of the council really understood that environments are getting more and more diverse, and they look a lot different from company to company. And PCI DSS is really applying to more companies as it grows and things like that, as credit cards get transferred to different service providers and things like that. So they wanted to bring this in as far as being able to meet the requirements in a different way, but in a mature and secure way where we are looking at risk, we are addressing those risks and things like that. So when we do a customized approach, really quick, as far as the work that takes throughout the year, it's no longer a point in time. You have to do the evaluation per year, but basically you document and maintain evidence around the customized control and how it's addressing the risks and things like that. They've put out a worksheet in the ROC reporting template, or at the end of the ROC, I think actually, that shows every detail that you have to document and things like that. You have to perform a targeted risk analysis specifically to that customized control, making sure that it is addressing and covering the risk of the original requirement. You have to perform testing for each customized approach to prove effectiveness. And this is ongoing testing that you should be doing throughout the year. And how are you monitoring it and things like that. And then you have to monitor and maintain that evidence for the effectiveness of the customized control. So the best way I can probably describe it is to give an example. And then if we have any questions, we can definitely address that. But as far as, so me and Chris, we talk to a lot of different companies. A lot of people say they want to do a customized approach, but it turns out to be a compensating control. So how do we really define the differences? It's really about, are you unable to meet a requirement due to a business or technical constraint, so you're doing a little extra in a different area to compensate for it? Or are you making a business decision to tackle risk in a different manner? So let me give you an example. So if an entity has a password on their system, but there's a technical constraint where it can't be a mix of numbers and letters, maybe a compensating control for that is, well, we've expanded it so the minimum character length is 25, even though they're only going to be alpha and not numeric. And doing that, we can show that 25 characters of just letters is the same strength as a smaller character set with a mix of number and letters. So that would be a compensating control. When we talk about a customized approach, maybe the company doesn't want to do passwords and they want to transfer over to like biometric authorization, or biometric and like key access on the systems and stuff like that to give a more seamless login. That would be more of a customized approach where you're taking a different look at the risk as far as access control. And instead of doing passwords, you're doing something totally different that then you would need to address and make sure that it's properly doing the right risk and covering the risk that needs to be. So Yeah, I guess that's
I
kind of
think that was a great answer.
overall. Yeah.
No, that was a really good answer, man. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, eh, if you can do the control, like if there's a constraint, it's a compensating control, right? If there's a reason you can't meet whatever the bar is, you're compensating in that case. If you're deciding to do it differently, that is where you would do the customized approach.
And one other thing,
Yeah.
like I said, customized approaches are really for mature programs that are out there. And one of the things they do is if you determine you want to do a customized approach to a control, the compensating control is no longer an option for that requirement. So if we're saying we're meeting it with biometrics and things like that, we can't come back later and say, well, yeah, we define that, but we're actually not doing that. What can we put in place to kind of mitigate that? You're not allowed to do that because you're actually defining the control. So when you define it, when you implement it, you need to make sure that you have a mature enough process to keep that going throughout the year, and you're doing everything you need to, and there's not a risk of it not being in place while the auditor is looking at it, and then you're trying to scramble to find a compensating control because they're not allowed to do compensating controls on customized approaches. So.
Yeah, I think the only other point I want to make with respect to the customized approach is there's no pressure to do customized approach, right? The defined approach is still perfectly fine.
Yeah,
it's still a very, like, I would say for many organizations, at least for the next 2 years, the defined approach probably is the way you should go. I would say it's more the exception for the folks who do the customized approach, simply because there's a tremendous amount of paperwork, right? And there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of documentation, there's a whole different process that has to be followed. The level of rigor is generally very high regarding it, so it definitely is not for everyone. And I've heard a lot of organizations ask me about or have some sort of anxiety around the customized approach and how are they supposed to do it, and like they're missing an opportunity. And for most organizations, just do the defined approach. It's okay. Like, it's really okay. You're not missing out, I promise. So I guess last question for you, Andrew, is what do I do if my company can't have the new requirements in by 2024? Like, what do I do?
Yeah, absolutely. So first I want to set it as far as that March 31st date, 2024 is the last day that you can attest against a 321. That does not mean all 321 assessments are dead at that date. And April 1st, everybody has to do a 4.0, right? If you do an assessment in November and it's against 321, you're good until November 2024, and then you have to do the 4.0. So I want to clear that up right away, as far as that's not a date that like anything that's been assessed against 321 goes away and you have to do a 4.0 right after that date. It just says no new reports after that can be against the 321 standard. So if you can't meet the requirements on the date that you have to do the 4.0, basically what I'll say is PCI has kind of allowed you or put in there future dated controls. A lot of the controls that require technical implementation or change to the environment are future dated to March 31st, 2025. So while you're assessing to 4.0 after March 31st, 2024, you have another year before you actually need to get those future dated controls in place. That's pretty much what I'll say on that one. Like I said, most of the controls that require changes are future dated, so they do give you that year buffer. And that first year, they can be not applicable because they are future dated. And then you'll just have a year to kind of implement those until 2025. So,
yeah, I think we're exactly on the same page. Like, for a lot of the controls that are not new, most of them are future dated. So if you don't have it in by 2024, it's considered best practice until March 31st of 2025. Your QSA should still identify it, right? It should still assess you against those controls, so you have visibility. But you would not have a non-compliant ROC if those controls are not in, those post or future dated controls are not in place. And then the last, I mentioned this earlier, but how should I go about defining my scope? Are there any resources or templates available? Corey actually linked the handout or the template in the chat. It'll also go in the comments on YouTube whenever this goes to YouTube. In terms of actually the process of defining scope, if you're a larger organization, you have a PCI team on staff, in combination with a good template to populate, as well as a good team that understands scoping, you should be an ISA, I would say. Like you either need an ISA or a QSA to actually facilitate this process for you, so you know it's accurate. You should be able to handle this process. If you don't have an ISA on staff, then I would encourage you strongly to find a partner, a QSA partner, or a PCI provider partner that can help you actually do this. And this is something that once it's done once is maintained over time, right? The only time you would need to revisit it or have the partner come back in is if you have a very significant change to your environment, meaning you had an acquisition or you created an entirely new product environment, you went to the cloud, like you weren't on cloud, in the cloud, things along those lines. You had some serious scope reduction happen, which is kind of the other side of that coin, right? You didn't add scope, you probably reduced it, but what is the actual residual now that we implemented, point-to-point encryption or tokenization? So yeah, strongly recommend you use a PCI specialist provider in this case. And ideally either current QSA or either a previous QSA. Good.
And you're recommending that because of it's better to define the scope, but also when the QSA comes in, any deltas in that scope versus what's actually in your environment automatically gets reported on your worksheet. So it's not something that you can perform and then throughout the assessment cycle tweak it and make changes to it. I mean, you definitely can, but those deltas are still going to show up on the report. So
yeah, that's a really good point. You want it to be correct, and you want it to be like based off of the PCI standard the first time. All right. All right. So just going through, just to recap, I know we're about 37 minutes in. I want to be cognizant of time. Couple of to-do list items we want to put on everyone's plate just between now and April of next year. Number one is start looking at your budget requests for the new control compliance, right? So there are a handful of new controls, right? We have this year most people's budgets are, you prepare them in Q3, maybe Q4, depending on when your fiscal year runs. But budgeting is either already happening for you or it's going to be starting in the next couple of months. And you have realistically 2 budget cycles to get the control, like any CapEx or OpEx approved for the things you're going to need to actually support these new requirements. So figure out when you actually need to get your budget requests in for things like, protecting the page that's loaded to the customer browser, right? Or the payment page loaded to the customer browser, or detecting, malicious activities on those pages, right? There's or doing authenticated internal scans. Some of this stuff is going to require actually either a new tool or a new process to be in place or additional headcount. There's going to be some budget required to meet these new controls. Don't sleep on it, and then you turn around next year and you're under the gun because you only have 1 budget cycle left, and your assessment's in April and it's October, and you're kind of in a pickle. So be very proactive on that end. In order to do that, most organizations get a 4.0 gap assessment in before they get to that, I guess, the second or the upcoming PCI or the upcoming budget cycle, right? So you want to get your gaps identified as soon as you can, at least directionally, so you can identify what budget or massive gaps you need to go fix. I know that we're happy to support in this case. We know there's a lot of other, but your QSA should be able to support in this case. If they can't, obviously give us a ring. We're happy to support and give you the information you need to actually make a determination on what your CapEx or OpEx spend is going to need to be directionally, right, to support compliance in the future. I know we're doing a lot of these during our assessments that are happening in 2023. So a lot of our clients have added on 4.0 assessments as a part of the current compliance cycle. And then it's the number 3 is find a really good find a good advisory partner, right? So like I said, this should be a current or past QSA. Current is generally better, just because they're up to date and they get the feeds on things, but past is not bad. They at least have training. And their purpose is to advise you, right? This is not your external QSA, right? They're not going to help you, they don't have the independence problem that your external QSA does, right? Do you want this entity or this person or this firm to be more of a trusted advisor to you? So for instance, if we were your QSA, right, I would advise you, if we have an independence, problem, like you may have to find somebody else to give you this advice because we can't solution on your behalf, right? Or if you already have an external QSA that you work with that does your rock, this is an opportunity where we would be able to support you because we don't have that independence issue. But we'll help you get in there and solution and figure out how to actually address some of these challenges you're running into. At minimum, you're going to need, I firmly believe every organization at minimum is going to need a phone a friend, a lifeline going into 4.0. Because you're going to have a question like, I don't understand, this is a new control, like QSA is asking for this, like what do I provide to them? How do we tackle this? This is kind of a weird scenario. I'm not used to this. So you don't want to have that happen when you're in the middle of your actual assessment, right? You want to have that, you don't want to have to go find a partner during your assessment. So be proactive and have at a minimum someone to call. Andrew, do you want to hop in here and just add anything else?
No, I think you hit it on the head.
You can say no.
So,
no, it's fine.
Yeah. No, nothing to add there.
Cool. All right. So responsibility and roles. So just wanted to spell it out pretty clearly in terms of like who's doing what, right? So Andrew, do you want to run through this?
Yeah, basically, what's the benefit of PCI partner? What kind of gaps are they filling in there, right? So kind of to hammer home that last slide, when we talk about like internal staff to these entities, what's their main goals when going from 3.2.1 to 4.0, right? They're there to try to identify controls deltas between the two of them. They're trying to implement the additional controls within the environment for 4.0, perform the business as usual tasks within the environment as per 4.0. And basically their end goal is trying to continue to gain the PCI DSS certification for the company, right? That's their end goal. As long as they get a passing cert, that's like the goal for the whole program. The external QSA, what's their goal, right? They're there to assess the environment against the PCI 4.0 controls. They're there to identify the gaps in the requirements from what you have in place to what the control standard is saying, and issue a report, whether that's compliant or non-compliant for the company based on what they saw, right? And then where does the PCI partner kind of fit in there? PCI partner can help you do all those internal staff items, but also they're going to help you identify, and because of their experience, they can advise the best path forward that they've seen at other companies or similar companies as well for the new controls. They can provide insight on what the QSA is going to be testing in this new requirements and these new standards and things like that, so that you don't have to waste time prepping your staff with things that aren't going to be asked in the end. Kind of eliminate some of that audit fatigue and have them ready to go right there.
I want to touch on that one real quick, Andrew. So I know we've gotten a lot of questions around 4.0 on, so what do you even provide, what do you even provide for this control? Like, what is the QSA going to even ask me for? What can I even show for some of these new controls, right? The ones around showing, that whatever's loaded to the actual payment page in the customer's browser is protected from like a mage cart style attack. Like, what do you show in that case, right? What is the QSA going to even ask me for? What do I tell all of my product teams or my like internal payment teams to do, right? So that's where an external or a PCI partner in this case would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they can also advise on opportunities for scope reduction within the environment. So the internal staff might not have the expertise to determine where they can reduce scope at. And then the external QSA isn't really looking for opportunities, right? They can't advise, they're just assessing. And also Yeah, they're just assessing. They're not advising, so they're not going to be telling you about scope identification and scope reduction, things that you could be doing. So having a knowledgeable PCI partner could come in, identify where your scope could be less if you just put in a couple controls, or maybe overhaul things to make your scope very manageable. Those are kind of things that they could do. And then the fourth one we kind of hit on a little bit, just working with the QSA and the internal staff while they're doing their assessment and things like that to reduce audit fatigue and improve the QSA's understanding of the controls, because sometimes there can be a little bit of a technical language barrier there, especially against like technical staff versus a QSA. And having that PCI partner that can kind of talk both sides and kind of understands and help you scope out your environment could definitely be beneficial with those assessments. So.
Yeah, it is very beneficial in most cases to have a QSA advocate essentially on the side of your table, right? Like who's talking to the QSA, who knows what they really are trying to do, who knows the DSS, and can help navigate some of the more complex either product environments or payment channels or use cases for different things or technologies. So yeah, completely agree, Andrew. So so in terms of like the content and what we had prepared, that's all we had. That's what we wanted to share with y'all today. We really wanted to walk through where things are right now versus where we're going with 4.0, like what the main differences are, what you need to be aware of, talk through some key questions that we're actually hearing from our clients or from folks we talk to in more just in a perspective or like a consulting role, and then to give you some good actionable next steps on what you need to do between now and probably April, and more than that, how you should consider or how you should kind of conceptualize your QSA versus like a PCI partner. The QSA being like the independent assessor, they're just going to call balls and strikes on how they see things, versus your partner, a PCI partner, who is going to help you actually navigate solution, scope, put things on paper, and help kind of get you from where you are into 4.0 and into ideally a compliant ROC or SAQ in a 4.0 world. So with that, Corey, we can take any questions from the audience.
Okay, yeah, guys, feel free to fill out questions in the question section. We've gotten one so far. So here's the question: with the new risk-based approach to control scoping, what sort of efficiencies can be gained with other frameworks such as ISO and NIST?
So I'll take a first shot at it, and then Andrew, if you want to hop in. So I would say in the current version of the DSS, right, where it's more of like an enterprise cyber, risk assessment, there's quite a few efficiencies that can be gained. In the future, because PCI is 4.0 is looking more for like targeted risk assessments, your ISO or your maybe an NIST 830 risk assessment may not provide the coverage you're looking for, because it'd have to be, or unless you are very intentional of including those areas where you have that risk that has to be assessed in the scope, right? So I would say if you're very intentional about it, you can include it and get the coverage there, but you have to plan for it. Andrew, do you have a different perspective on that one?
Yeah, so while it's not totally there and you're not gonna have like one framework for everything yet, you can see where PCI is getting more risk-based, which is kind of what NIST is doing. For example, NIST a couple years ago released its statement about it's now recommending or preferring longer passwords with longer passwords with not so much rotation of those passwords, where that was a conflict with PCI in 3.2.1, right? But they've actually changed that to kind of more aligned with NIST. And basically what 4.0 says is you have the longer passwords, and through that risk assessment, you can determine how often you need to change those. So it is doing shifts more towards that. It's not 100% there where you can just have one framework and kind of add modules in and stuff like that. But you definitely can see efficiencies there where if you define that periodicness and keeping in mind PCI requirements plus the NIST requirements, those types of controls could be used to meet both standards or multiple standards. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other questions, Corey?
Yeah, we got one more here. As a version 3.2.1 compliant organization, what is the estimated lift to implement 4.0?
Andrew, do you want to take this one?
You
You could say no. That's fine. I can take a shot
Yeah,
at it.
you
if
can
want to.
start. I want to pull
Okay.
up the deltas really quick to give some numbers.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I think there's like 60 net new controls. You can check me on that one. I would say the delta really is dependent on like your organizational scope. Like how do you interact with card data? Because if you don't store card data at all, like you're more of a service provider, you're a 3.321 compliant service provider that doesn't have any payment pages yourself. Like the impact may or will be much less than if you're a merchant that stores card data and hosts your own payment pages for clients, right? Like there's more controls, obviously, more net new controls that would be applicable to you. So it's really hard to give you a ballpark on level of effort. In a previous webinar, I'll say this. In a previous webinar we did, we went through and we identified how impactful the changes are from 3.2.1 to 4.0, like low, medium, and high. Like what how much change is there, and how high what we would expect if that was applicable to you, like if requirement 6 was applicable to you, or how would you see a huge change in like the activity and like what you have to do. So we did that in a previous webinar, which I'm sure we can go find and link in the YouTube video just as a reference, or I think it's maybe in the previous series we did around the transition to 4.0. But off the top of my head, I really can't give you a good ballpark other than the number of controls that are net new. Andrew, do you have that number?
Yep. So it's 65 new or updated where there would be changes to the environment that need to happen. But that is including a bunch of them grouped together as far as like the roles and responsibility. It just made sense to group those together. So 65 pretty much net new or changing where you have to have some changes. Again, it is determined, like, are you storing credit card data? That's why it's important to kind of have that PCI partner to kind of walk through, because not everybody's going to be the same, and just kind of get that understanding of the environment. So yeah.
Yep. Sorry we couldn't give you a better dollar number answer, but that one really is it depends kind of answer.
Yeah, we actually we have one last question.
Sure.
It's around like if they need support with this, how can they get in contact with Risk 360 to start the process?
Yeah, great question. So go to risk360.com. There's a contact us page that'll go right to our sales team, and his name is Ross. You'll probably talk to Ross, and Ross will connect you to myself and Andrew. Happy to have a conversation with you, even if it's to talk through things and help you kick things around, things that you're looking at or challenges you're kind of facing. Love to help you to think through those and see if we can help you find a good solution to those, like those questions, those problems. Also, Andrew and I are on LinkedIn. Feel free to find us, connect with us, and shoot us a DM if you need to.
Yeah, and I didn't know this was going on YouTube, so make sure you like and subscribe.
That's a good one, Andrew.
Yeah, we got to get that algorithm up, and we'll try to get sponsored next time. So, like all the good YouTube content creators.
This video has been brought to you by Risk 360.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So thank you guys today. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Andrew, for doing great content. Thanks, everybody, for attending. If you are interested in watching this, there'll be a follow-up email sent out tomorrow, so you can share with your colleagues, your bosses. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Everybody have a good day.
Awesome. Thank y'all.
Have a good one. Bye.